Okay, everybody, it's Fantasy Author's Handbook. Phil again here on YouTube in the downtown office. Let's talk about science fiction subgenres, or even if there are any. If you saw the previous video about fantasy subgenres, was it too much for you? The fact that I'd narrowed it down to only three. Epic fantasy means I am going to save the world. High fantasy means I'm going to save the realm, the kingdom, etc. And sword and sorcery is I'm going to save myself. And then everything else can be broken down into one of those three things. I also last time had what my sort of short, succinct definition of the genre in the first place, that fantasy is any story in which the impossible is made possible by some form of magic, right? How are we teleporting or whatever? We just do it. There's a crystal ball or whatever that is energized with mana. Science fiction has almost exactly the same definition. Science fiction is a story in which the impossible is made possible by some imagined technology or science, right? In reality, according to Einstein anyway, and here I'm recording this in October of 2023. To my knowledge, a faster than light starship has not yet been invented. Maybe there's a secret, thing going on at Area 51 that I'm not privy to. I doubt it. So that means it's impossible for us right now today in the real world. Science fiction, you see starships whizzing about the entire universe all the time, right? But they are assumed to be built by someone. So even in things that are kind of science light, Star Wars, right, is full of spaceships that clearly someone has built, that Han and Chewie are constantly repairing with tools. It's a machine, right? And you bang on the side of it, and it comes back to life, whatever. But it's a thing that people have made. It's not just I'm conjuring it out of the mana, whatever. So that's science fiction, right? The impossible is made possible by some kind of technology. So how do we break this down, right? Is it the same sort of thing? Could we say it's epic science fiction if it's about I want to save, the universe or the Federation or something? Or it's high fantasy if I want to save this one planet or the space station. And then it's what I guess we could call space opera instead of sword and sorcery. Then it's I want to just save myself. I guess maybe, right? But I think science fiction has slightly different demands. And that for me kind of put them into two camps, but this is a spectrum this time. I like to think of science fiction as a ratio. This is hard for me because I'm not a math guy, right? A ratio of science to fiction. Yes? Think of it as a balance. Maybe I'll have a graphic of a little scale going up and down. Who knows? So it's a ratio of science to fiction. Some books, let's just talk about books, will have lots more science, right? It's more weighted to science, less to fiction. So this seems weird because this means high or whatever. More science, less fiction, or lots of fiction, almost no science. And they can still be science fiction. Absolutely. They still fit into that overarching genre, which is defined again as the impossible is made possible by some sort of imagined science or technology. So what are those differences, right? What are some examples? I got some. One of my favorite, what you would call hard science fiction, which means that ratio is weighted more toward the science than the fiction, is the brilliant Darwin's Radio by the late, great Greg Bear. Very impeccably researched. Feels there is sort of a one weird thing quality to it. It is our world in which some sort of evolutionary jump has taken place. And it is, I guess rationalized might be the word, as a scientific, a natural process. So this is imagined science is taking place, right? Or science has identified something new added to the world. This definitely tilts the balance more toward science than fiction. Yet at the same time, because Greg Bear was particularly brilliant as a hard science fiction author in particular, it's still a very uniquely human. It's a very much character-driven story. Let's be honest, all stories are character-driven, like as opposed to furniture-driven. But anyway, Darwin's Radio is brilliant. If you haven't read it, you gotta read it. Definitely hard science fiction in that ratio is tipped more science, a little bit less on the fiction side. And that's a tradition really that goes back to lots of those, early and even current, obviously, hard science fiction authors where there's a little bit more science, even if those are sort of the soft sciences. This is maybe not the greatest example of Heinlein's hard science fiction, but he was one of the originals. And he came out of the tradition of John W. Campbell's Astounding magazine, which is still in print as analog, changed its name to analog, and is still out there. Actually still doing pretty well. If you haven't read this book and you're interested in science fiction even a little bit, I beg you to go out and get it. You just have to have this. It is a fascinating story of how a particular editor basically took it upon himself to change science fiction. He was the guy who decided there needs to be more science in that ratio than we're normally getting, right? Back in the sort of pulp fiction days, there was a lot of, which we'll see, softer science fiction, which was lots more fiction, kind of vaguely inspired by science-y sort of kind of stuff. And it was John W. Campbell, also really probably best known for most people as the author of the story Who Goes There, which became The Thing, right? The three different versions of the Thing in the movies. But, this really tells the story of that sort of sea change in science fiction, weighting science more than fiction, about John W. Campbell and the authors that he really worked with, Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, and L. Ron Hubbard, right? So get this one. Alex Navalny, really, really brilliant. This was a story of the birth of hard science fiction, or, right, a ratio in which more science as opposed to fiction. So is this still going, right? Is there really hard science fiction? And what is the kind of limits to that? It's hard, I think, in 2023 to really sort of sell a book that is like the very early Heinlein stories, which is, I have really sat down and read all the literature and tried to figure out what could possibly go wrong with a nuclear reactor, and my story is going to be that thing goes wrong and the hero has to fix it. And if you read some of the early, astounding stories by Heinlein, you get a lot of that kind of stuff. Basically, I have an engineering project, and if I don't finish it, it's going to explode. That might be a tough sell, right? But how about Bewilderment by Richard Powers? Huge bestseller. I read this, I was really taken with it. I was kind of bewildered by it. This is a science fiction novel. It's kind of not really sold as one. It's surprising that there's a science fiction novel that was chosen for the Oprah Book Club, I think. But it's entirely a science fiction novel. And it imagines a very plausible, right? And again, this is coming from a scientist himself. Very plausible technology that then affects a family, really, a father and son in particular, very, very deeply. And it digs very deeply into what that means if that scientific breakthrough takes place. What does that mean to that relationship? So hard science fiction, or science fiction that definitely is well researched, well thought through, plausible science, right? Not realistic per se, because if it's realistic, it's not science fiction, right? But it has to be internally plausible. So this definitely is. And it's not just about the machine, and oh no, we have to fix the machine, and once we fix the machine, the end, yay. And that's pretty much it. And the characters are just sort of there to serve that goal. This is entirely reads like that sort of literary fiction that is all character, all character, all character, which the best science fiction, by the way, has always been. So hard science fiction, is that what we're calling it? Science fiction that weights that ratio more toward the science than the fiction, but then balances? Yeah. So where those early Heinlein stories that were really all about the technology would be like 9 part science and 1 part fiction. This might balance a little bit more toward the fiction because the science is kind of there's only one sort of science fiction-y science or imagined science. And then it's really about how that affects this very tight relationship of the father and son. Does it balance out? I don't know, right? Hey, have you read this? Comment below and tell me what you think. But okay, so Phil, what about the other genres? Because clearly you're just crazy, or there's definitely subgenres. It can't all just be about the ratio of science to fiction. There's cyberpunk. I was into cyberpunk when it was brand new. I just didn't really realize it. I just really love Neuromancer, and William Gibson, a brilliant writer. I think this is a little bit more hard science fiction than it is, oh, I hate the term, soft science fiction. And one of my dogs knew that I was about to say soft science fiction and was trying to stop me. Is cyberpunk a thing? I mean, it's kind of not really a thing anymore. Weirdly, because a lot of what William Gibson and the early cyberpunk authors were imagining is now real. I saw an interview with William Gibson where he was talking about Neuromancer, and he said that, which was published in like 1984, 85. He said that if a young person started to read Neuromancer now, they would think it was a story about what the world was like when all of the cell phones disappeared. Because he, of course, had no idea that technology was right around the corner, and how transformative they would be. So, but at the same time, in that period, he was kind of trying to make it sound as plausible as possible. And even though he admitted to not really doing the research, not to the degree that somebody like Heinlein or Baer would do, still he's sort of a little bit actually more science than you might think. Certainly in comparison to other stuff that we're going to look at. What do you call Dune? By the same rules as we, or that I personally applied to fantasy, is this epic science fiction because we're going to save the universe? But not really, right? Because it's also, well, I'm going to save my family, the Atreides. And it's 100% pronounced Atreides, so whatever. Is it, we're going to save just the world of Arrakis? Does that make it high science fiction? I don't think that's a thing. That's not a thing. I don't want to make that a thing. So what is this? Is this hard science fiction? Because there is a lot of thought into how stuff works. Frank Herbert didn't put, research into, exactly the same kind of stuff that like Heinlein would do, the sort of exact workings of a nuclear reactor. But he did put an awful lot of research, and in fact, this was inspired by the research that he had done anyway, into, sort of the ecological balance and the desertification of places, and it definitely also had a political point to it, right? Hey, everybody, let me tell you about the dangers of a single resource economy. If the entire world is run on one thing, and the only place to get it is underneath the desert where people who don't like you live, right? So what is this? Is this hard science fiction? I think it kind of is. I think there's a little bit more science in Dune than there is fiction. I think it really is a story about, I know what can happen when we overexploit resources, and I'm going to tell a story about that. And has that disappeared? Has that point disappeared for a lot of people? Does it become about the sort of the big dramatic romance parts? I don't know, right? But again, I would tilt the ratio of Dune a little bit more toward the science. And of course, if it's science fiction, there's some science. And if it's fiction at all, there's obviously lots of fiction. But we'll still sort of take this as a sort of, example or a frame of reference. After this sort of Campbell revolution of we're not going to do the fun, silly stuff anymore. And by the fun, silly stuff, I mean things like this, right? There's this great, is this a Frazetta cover? I think it might be. I don't know. Maybe it is. Whatever. It's super cool. Anyway, old ace edition of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Carson of Venus, right? This is science fiction. It's set on the planet Venus. Everyone at the time that it was written, which was really a long time ago, it was 1937 is the earliest copyright here. They kind of thought that maybe Venus did have like big oceans there, and that it was this primordial world, kind of like the Earth in the age of dinosaurs and stuff. So you got a lot of stories about Venus as the abode of dinosaur-like creatures, right? Giant monsters and big oceans and stuff like that. And then decades go by, lots more science intrudes. There's no ocean on Venus. It's 850 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is still science fiction? Question mark. There's definitely fantasy kind of elements in all of these, very much like his great Mars series, which is one of my favorites of all time. Is that science fantasy? Sure. And why not? Yeah. But it begins with an idea, it's a real place. And what are people saying about that real place? Edgar Rice Burroughs was taking what people were saying Mars was like at the time. They were saying, hey, we have found canals, which was a mistranslation of canali, and we think that there was a civilization there, it might still be, who have built these canals to bring water from the ice caps to try to, grow food in the desert, right? Whereas it's clear that the rest of the planet is a desert. We've been there now, or probes have been there. Mars isn't like that. Venus isn't like this. But at the time, it seemed like maybe it was. So a little bit of science, and whether or not in the future, right? This written in 1937, me sitting here talking to you on a machine that wasn't invented in 1937 about the science in a science fiction novel. Everything that we write is going to be overtaken by events, I guarantee you. If William Gibson is walking around now going like, oh man, if I had just thought of the smartphone, that would have really, really helped this novel have legs into the 2020s. How's he going to know that? Nobody knew that, right? He also had the Soviet Union still there. 2001: A Space Odyssey had basically everything wrong about the year 2001. That is something that is going to happen to maybe 9 out of every 9 science fiction authors. You don't know exactly what the world is going to be like. People have tried to predict it. Weirdly, now there's a lot of people in tech who are trying to make science fiction stuff come true. And most of the time that's really, really frightening. The AI thing that's happening seems to be happening very, very recklessly. Whatever. But whatever you imagine the future might be like, and this is advice I've given to anyone who will listen who's writing science fiction, don't say the year. You don't have to say that it's 2001. You don't have to say that it's 2123. It's the future. And whatever the future is, you're not really talking about what you think the future is going to be like. And I'm talking to all of you, everybody who starts writing a science fiction novel. maybe that you start with that. Like, hey, there's this trend in AI. There's this trend in, private spaceflight, etc., electric cars, or, I'm looking around and seeing the effects of climate change, undeniably happening. What's that going to make the world look like? Can somebody figure out how to reverse that? You're thinking about what technology might happen in the future, whether the recent, or the near future, or the way out in 20,000 years from now, Dune future. But let's be honest, you're not really going to get there, right? It's still going to be a story like Dune was a story about oil, right? And coming from, what was this, 1964, 65. And nobody listened. And I don't think we're really even still listening. So then, so we've seen these books that have tipped the science to fiction ratio, more science, less fiction. How about some examples of going the other way, right? Where it's not even bewilderment, where the science is very plausible, just kind of a little bit, and it's really a story about, this relationship between the father and son. As important as Campbell was in astounding and creating the so-called hard science fiction, or tilting that ratio more towards science, this book, Dangerous Visions by edited by Harlan Ellison, took a really big step into popularizing, at least, putting out there into the zeitgeist, into the culture, what was then called New Wave science fiction, and I think is now called science fiction. And in this anthology, he's publishing, not for the first time, but collected in a way, and in the United States, where a lot of these authors were from the UK, but he's presenting authors that would have told John W. Campbell pretty much where to go, and thought, do I really have to do basically go get a PhD in nuclear physics to write a story? These are authors like J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison himself, who gave very few you-know-whats about the math. But this is where we really started to see authors being encouraged to say, it's maybe we're putting quotes around science. It's science fiction, right? It's science fiction in that there's no magic in it per se. Maybe I am sort of setting it in the future, kinda, right? And this is where some authors kind of transitioned, like Frederick Pohl, who is in this book, from a hard science fiction author, very much in that Campbell vein, to somebody who's kind of expanding that. In the same way I held up Stranger in a Strange Land by Heinlein, kind of moving away from this is rigidly about the plausible science experiment, and more into, okay, I feel like it's reasonable for somebody to say, like, yeah, I could see they built that machine. And then it's about the effect that it has on people. And to me, I think that's really where science fiction is living more and more now. There is still sort of military science fiction, which is again a subgenre that, I don't know, they're kind of still out there. It's definitely lost a little bit of favor. That still is a version of hard science fiction that's tilting that balance more toward the science and a little bit less toward the fiction. It's about what sort of enemies would we imagine we might be fighting in the future, what sort of weapons will we be using and they be using, and so on. And then it's really about a pretty clear-cut conflict. But there are some that, to me, kind of blow this up, and is what makes it really difficult to say, like I did with fantasy, these are the three subgenres. In particular, there is the question of space opera. And in the Guide to Writing Fantasy and Science Fiction, which is sort of where these initial ideas came from, I said that space opera was essentially the same as, and I just said it earlier, is the same as sword and sorcery fantasy. It's the much more personal, much more action driven. So, space opera was some of my favorite old books, that were just about flying through the universe. Is definitely Star Wars and encountering monsters and aliens and robots. And it's all just, very much plot and action driven, which is a gas. It's a hoot. It's great. Now, though, I'm getting the sense that that space opera is being applied to really any science fiction that happens in space, that there are any spaceships at all, right? Essa Hansen actually described this to me personally as space opera. And then I read it and I was kind of like, yeah, right. I mean, it's definitely set in space. There's lots of action. There's a lot of cool stuff going on. I mean, this book just starts right away and just flies through some crazy world building. And that's where I start to kind of disengage from the idea that this is space opera. I would compare it lots more to Dune, believe it or not. I know, right? High praise. There are so many crazy, huge ideas here. The science is so far beyond what, Heinlein would have ever done in terms of, hey, I can kind of make a case to Campbell that they're working on this, or in the next X number of years, with X being very small, 20 years or so, this is technology that might be here. She's way out into the future and way out into technology that, it was Arthur C. Clarke, right, who famously or infamously said that any advanced technology, suitably advanced technology, is indistinguishable from magic. And I guess, right, like if you went in a time machine and dragged somebody from the year 1023 and brought them 1,000 years forward and sort of walked them around the world, he'd be like, there's, like giant roaring things in the sky and images of people talking from as if from nowhere. Would they think it was magic? I don't know. I tend to give our ancestors lots more credit than that. I think they were already understanding that people make stuff. And once you started to find a common language and work them through, first you need to understand electricity, etc., you could probably explain stuff to them, at least in a way that says, we're not, like unto gods or whatever, that we're just people. And this definitely falls into that, right? No Fed Laws and the Graven series, or a trilogy. All 3 books are out. You got to get them. You got to read these books. Imagine that, right? A level of technology that's so far out there that we're just trusting Essa Hansen to whip us through this thing at faster than light speed. So this is the kind of book you strap into and go. Is it space opera, though? Because it's not just, there's the, I'm the clearly defined hero, I'm Luke Skywalker. And there is the overly well-defined villain of Darth Vader. And we have a fight. And when I win the fight, the story is over. Yeah. And I know that that's maybe not being completely fair to the bigger Star Wars picture, but it was really what he was going for, actually, at least in that first movie. She's way beyond that in terms of who exactly is a hero, what does a hero mean, who exactly is a villain, what does a villain mean. And so, therefore, science, really, really richly imagined, but way beyond anything that, anyone can say, here's how you do it, or here's how even you might do it. And fiction way up there in terms of personal relationships and so on. So again, where do you put this? Sword and sorcery? No Fed Gloss? I don't think so. But then where, right? It's not technically hard science fiction. So again, the point I'm going for here is that those distinctions are really not there. I think it's all just a ratio. And in some cases, you may be more drawn to the, more science. You may be drawn to, I don't really care about the temperature at which paper actually lights on fire, which Ray Bradbury made up. That's not real science. Fahrenheit 451. It's really not about the science. It's about the people, the world, the society. Right? So then in science fiction, are there really subgenres, and do subgenres really matter? Or is it really just about how you tilt those scales, how you populate those ratios? Lots of science and a little bit of fiction, or lots of fiction, a little bit of science, or somewhere balanced in between. And that might be where, sort of the best of them are, balanced in between, right? Like Gene Wolfe, like Essa Hansen, like Frank Herbert, like William Gibson, etc. Right? And the shelves behind me, you can almost pick out any one of these that isn't fantasy, because I have science fiction and fantasy mixed in, because whatever. But Philip Jose Farmer, for sure, is up here. Harlan Ellison, we know. So that's what I think, right? That science fiction as a genre is expressed not as a series of rigid subgenres, but as a ratio of science to fiction. Yes? Agree or disagree? Give me a like anyway, because it's an idea worth talking about. Have an argument? No, Phil, you're nuts. Yeah, hey man, you're right. Comment below. You got to comment, yeah? And subscribe. If you aren't subscribed to this, I don't even understand why you're not subscribed. I'm taking that personally. I'm taking it personally face, because I'm a brilliant actor. Okay, then, that was Fantasy Author's Handbook. I'm Phil. I kind of blew up the notion of science fiction subgenres at all.